She thought she was walking toward a dream job. Instead, she was walking toward her own grave. In May 1861, a young French maid named Marie Pichon accompanied a soft-spoken peasant into the dark country lanes of Montluel. She fought her way out of his grasp, unwittingly uncovering a 10-year murder mill run by a husband and a wife who slaughtered servants just to strip and sell their clothes. This is the terrifying case of the Dumollards and the peasant cottage history called Bluebeard's Castle. If you enjoy true cases where the law becomes the real mystery, subscribe, because these stories only get stranger. To understand how this nightmare began, you have to look at the streets of Lyons in the mid-19th century. The city was a booming industrial hub, pulling thousands of poor, uneducated young women from the countryside. These girls arrived with nothing but a single suitcase, desperate to find work as domestic maids in wealthy households. They were the perfect targets. They were isolated, completely unprotected, and invisible to the legal system. And sitting at the city gates, watching them arrive, was Martin Dumollard. To the young women looking for guidance, Dumollard appeared to be a gentle, soft-spoken older peasant. He would approach them with an air of quiet respect, introducing himself as a manager or a representative for a grand aristocratic estate outside of town. He promised them excellent wages, comfortable quarters, and an honorable position. For a young woman facing poverty in a strange city, it sounded like a miracle. In May 1861, Marie Pichon became his next target. She listened to his kind assurances, trusted his gentle demeanor, and willingly picked up her bags to follow him. They boarded a train and walked out into the countryside, heading toward what she believed was a bright future. But as the gaslights of the city faded away, the rural lanes of Montluel grew pitch black, and the soft-spoken peasant began to slow his pace. As they moved deeper into the deserted country lanes, the gentle old man Marie thought she knew completely vanished. Without a word of warning, Dumollard pounced on her in the dark, throwing his hands around her neck and attempting to strangle her. But Marie was young, strong, and fueled by pure survival instinct. Instead of freezing, she fought back with everything she had, tearing at his face and breaking his grip on her throat. She managed to wrench herself free and bolted into the pitch-black woods, running blindly through the brush until she finally reached safety. Terrified and bleeding, Marie made it to the local authorities. She gave the gendarmerie a detailed description of the soft-spoken man who had tried to murder her and the direction he had fled. The police immediately mobilized, tracking the suspect down to a small, unassuming rural cottage in the area. They expected to find a typical violent thief. They had no idea they were about to step into one of the most horrifying crime scenes in European history. When the gendarmes crossed the threshold of the Dumollard cottage, the quiet exterior of the peasant home shattered. They found themselves standing inside what the French press would soon call a peasant Bluebeard's Castle. It was not a house of hidden torture devices, but something far more chilling. It was a warehouse of the dead. Everywhere investigators looked, they found piles of women's clothing. Trunks, wardrobes, and floorboards were stuffed to the brim with hundreds of silk dresses, linen aprons, bonnets, petticoats, and personal handkerchiefs. There were far more clothes than a poor peasant woman like Madame Dumollard could ever come by honestly. Outside, the horror deepened. Investigators began probing the muddy earth around the cottage garden. It didn't take long before they exhumed the bodies of 3 young women, hurriedly buried in shallow graves. But when the authorities demanded to know where the rest of the owners of those hundreds of dresses were, they learned a darker truth. Most of the victims had simply been flung into the fast-moving currents of the nearby River Rhône, swept away by the water to ensure they would never be found. With the evidence piling up around the cottage, the authorities turned their attention to Martin's wife, Marie Dumollard. Under intense interrogation, she cracked, exposing the terrifying, mechanical reality of their household. She confessed that for over 10 years, she and her husband had run a highly organized murder mill. The operation was strictly divided. Martin took a sickening pleasure in the physical hunt, luring the girls from the city and violently killing them in the dark. But Marie was not a passive bystander. She was the logistics manager of the enterprise. Once the victims were dead, Marie Anne took over. She stripped the corpses, meticulously washed the blood out of the fabrics, and cataloged the stolen goods. She kept the finest silk dresses and garments for herself, and systematically sold the remaining clothes at local markets to supplement the family income. They had turned serial murder into a routine livestock harvest, treating the lives of young women as nothing more than a retail commodity. How could a horror like this continue for 10 whole years without the authorities raising a hand? The answer lies in a fatal blind spot within the 19th century French justice system. The law completely failed to protect the transient working class. Whenever a poor country girl suddenly vanished from her city job, the police didn't launch a homicide investigation. They didn't even cross-reference missing persons files. Instead, judges, employers, and magistrates simply assumed the girl had broken her contract, stolen away in the night, or fallen into a life of vice. Because society viewed these young maids as disposable, the system treated their disappearances as entirely routine. This total lack of due process created a perfect legal loophole. The Dumollards realized that if you prey on the people the law chooses to ignore, the system itself becomes your invisible shield. It took a victim fighting back with her own two hands to force the courts to finally look into the dark. In 1862, the gates of the courthouse in Bourg-en-Bresse swung open for a trial that transfixed the entire nation of France. But as the prosecutors prepared their case, they hit a massive legal hurdle. They were dealing with a suspected decade of slaughter, but they only had 3 recovered bodies. Under the legal standards of the time, you could not easily convict someone of mass murder based on missing persons reports alone. To overcome this, the prosecution engineered a brilliant, highly unusual courtroom strategy. If they couldn't produce the bodies, they would use the mountain of stolen property as a direct stand-in for the dead. The courtroom floor was transformed into a macabre viewing gallery, draped in hundreds of dresses, shawls, and bonnets pulled from the Dumollard cottage. The state then called dozens of grieving rural families to the stand. One by one, mothers and sisters wept as they identified specific hand-stitched embroidery, unique patches, and familiar fabric patterns. By matching the clothing to the exact names of missing girls, the prosecution legally tied the couple to a trail of victims who had otherwise vanished completely from the face of the earth. The mountain of physical evidence left no room for doubt. The jury found the couple guilty, and the court handed down a swift, definitive sentence. Martin Dumollard was condemned to death. In early 1862, he was led to the public square and executed by the guillotine, remaining cold and completely unrepentant until the very end. But the final legal battle focused on his wife, Marie Anne. Her defense team argued for mercy, claiming she was a submissive, terrified spouse who only helped her husband out of fear for her own life. The court flatly rejected this argument. The judges ruled that her systematic washing, sorting, and selling of the victim's clothes proved she was not a hostage of fear, but an active partner in profit. She was sentenced to 20 years of harsh forced labor in a penal colony, where she would eventually die. This landmark case forced the French justice system to entirely re-examine how it tracked missing persons and protected the migrant working class. It proved a chilling legal truth. When the law fails to guard the most vulnerable members of society, it accidentally shields the predators who hunt them. What do you think about the court's decision regarding the wife? Was 20 years of forced labor a fair sentence for her role, or should she have shared her husband's fate at the guillotine? Comment below and subscribe for more deep dives into the dark history of the justice system.